Every single year, tens of millions of people just lie down on an operating table and they count backward from 10.
Right. And they willingly let a doctor completely sever the communication networks in their brain.
Yeah, exactly. If you've ever had surgery, you know the feeling. You blink, and suddenly you're waking up in recovery. You are completely unaware of the hours that have passed.
You know, we casually call it going to sleep, which sounds so gentle.
Right, but chemically speaking, this intervention is it's one of the most unnatural, profound, and frankly perilous biological states a human being can actually survive.
It really is. I mean, we treat it with such routine casualty today, but putting a human body into the state of like suspended animation and then successfully pulling them back out of it is an absolute pharmacological tightrope walk.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today on Deep Dive, we are looking at this fascinating stack of pharmacology and medical history sources, all about general anesthetics.
It's some seriously incredible material.
It really is. And our mission today is to demystify exactly how these drugs work. We want to look under the hood of unconsciousness, explore the mechanics of how we shut the body down, and figure out what that ultimately tells us about the nature of the human brain itself.
Yeah, and to really appreciate the biological mechanics, we first have to understand the sheer desperation that drove us to invent this chemical tightrope in the first place.
Right.
Before we get into how anesthesia works, we have to look at the brutal reality of, well, the bloody race against consciousness that existed before it.
Because the sources paint a picture of pre-1846 surgery that reads like an actual horror movie.
It was literal butchery. I mean, out of necessity, of course. If you needed surgery before 1846, there was no pausing. There was no careful, delicate exploration of tissues.
And you're just wide awake?
Wide awake. Patients were physically held down by strong assistants. As a mercy, you might be given some whiskey.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, or maybe a dose of opium if you were really lucky. Or honestly, just a piece of leather to bite down on so you didn't shatter your own teeth.
Which basically meant the only metric of a good surgeon back then was pure, unadulterated speed.
Exactly. Amputations weren't timed in hours or even minutes. They were timed in seconds.
Seconds. That is insane.
It was a terrifying race to finish the procedure before the patient died of shock or just from blood loss caused by their own violent thrashing.
So when the breakthrough finally happened, it fundamentally altered the trajectory of human medicine. And we actually have a specific date and a specific room for this turning point, right?
Yeah.
October 16th, 1846.
Yes, at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston.
In that amphitheater they now call the Ether Dome.
That day changed the world. You had a Boston dentist named William T.G. Morton, and he administered inhaled dipole ether to a patient, Edward Gilbert Abbott.
Okay.
Then the sustained surgeon, John Collins Warren, stepped up and successfully removed a vascular tumor from Abbott's neck.
And Abbott didn't scream. He didn't thrash around. He just sat there in total silence.
Right, and afterward, he reported feeling absolutely no pain. The profound shock in that room it cannot be overstated.
I could imagine.
Warren actually turned to the audience of these hardened, cynical physicians in the amphitheater and delivered a line that is now legendary in medical history. He said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug."
Gentlemen, this is no humbug. It perfectly captures that total disbelief. Like they had just witnessed the impossible.
They really had.
But, reading through these historical notes, there is this incredibly tragic subplot about who actually gets the credit for this miracle. Because Morton is the famous name, but he wasn't technically the first to do it.
No, he wasn't. History, unfortunately, is written by the people who publish, not always the people who discover.
Right.
A Georgia physician named Crawford Long had actually used ether to remove a neck tumor back in 1842.
So that's 4 years before the Ether Dome.
Exactly. But he was a rural doctor, and he wanted to gather more cases to prove it wasn't just the placebo effect or, mesmerism. So he delayed publishing his results until 1849. And by waiting, he totally lost the historical priority.
The story that really got to me, though, is Horace Wells. He was Morton's former dental partner, and his trajectory is just heartbreaking.
It's honestly one of medicine's darkest chapters. In 1844, so 2 years prior to the successful ether demonstration, Wells attempted a public demonstration of his own.
Right, using nitrous oxide.
Yeah, laughing gas, for a dental surgery at that exact same Boston hospital. But he misjudged the dose.
Oh, no.
The patient cried out in pain during the extraction. The audience hissed, they openly mocked him, and they basically declared the demonstration a total failure. Wells was just completely humiliated.
And the psychological toll of that was absolute. He left in disgrace. He eventually developed a severe chloroform addiction, and tragically, he took his own life in 1848.
It's terrible. His biographers draw a direct line from that public failure to his death.
But looking at this whole timeline, it raises a glaring question for me. I was floored to read that the chemist Humphrey Davy actually wrote about the pain-relieving properties of nitrous oxide way back in 1799.
Yes, he did.
He explicitly stated it could be used for surgical operations. So how is it possible that a discovery that could end surgical torture just sat completely unused for almost half a century? Like, how does that just gather dust?
What's fascinating here is the absolute siloing of knowledge during that era. I mean, you had brilliant chemists experimenting with these volatile gases at parties. They were literally called ether frolics or laughing gas parties.
Wow.
And entirely separate from that, you had surgeons operating in conditions of absolute butchery. The two worlds just didn't cross-pollinate at all.
So it took a dentist.
Exactly. Someone who dealt intimately with excruciating human pain, but also tinkered with chemical agents in his office. It took a dentist to finally bridge that gap.
So the dentist brings the party drug into the operating room, and overnight, surgery becomes survivable. But a massive cultural shift like that is rarely smooth, right? Because even after the medical efficacy was proven, there was intense pushback, particularly from the church.
Oh, the religious debate was fierce, specifically regarding childbirth. In 1847, a Scottish obstetrician named James Young Simpson introduced chloroform for labor pain.
Okay.
But when he started administering it to pregnant women, local clergy vehemently objected. They pointed to Genesis 3.16. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, arguing that pain in labor was a divine mandate.
So they thought doctors had no business interfering with it.
Exactly.
That is a theological blockade against pain relief. How did they finally get past that?
Well, the debate raged until 1853, when Queen Victoria herself requested and accepted chloroform for the birth of Prince Leopold.
The royal endorsement.
Right. Once the reigning monarch normalized it, the religious objections just conveniently melted away. But this mass adoption created a terrifying new blind spot.
Because doctors were suddenly plunging thousands of people into this artificial sleep without having any idea what the chemicals were actually doing to the human brain.
Right.
Which brings us to the biggest myth we really need to shatter today. If we look at the modern clinical reality, we have to unlearn the way we casually talk about this stuff. Because the most common misconception is that general anesthesia is just a medically induced deep sleep.
It's a comforting analogy for sure, but biologically, it is entirely false.
Right.
Natural sleep is this dynamic cyclical process. Your brain cycles through active reversible states like REM sleep. Anesthesia completely obliterates those cycles. Under anesthesia, your brain is forced into a state called burst suppression.
Let's break that down because the visual in the sources is really striking. What does burst suppression actually mean for the neurons?
Okay, so think of normal brain waves like a constant humming symphony of electrical chatter. Burst suppression is what happens when that symphony just collapses.
Okay.
If you look at an EEG monitor, you see periods of a complete flatline, total electrical silence in the cortex, interrupted only by sporadic, violent spikes of activity.
So the brain is fundamentally struggling to fire.
Exactly. And crucially, a sleeping person can always be woken up by a loud noise or a hard shake. A patient in the depths of general anesthesia cannot be awakened by any external stimulation.
It's an entirely different biological realm. The sources actually define modern anesthesia not as one single effect, but as a bundle of 4 distinct components, right?
That's right. To achieve true general anesthesia, you must actively maintain 4 separate pillars. First is unconsciousness, meaning the total loss of awareness. Second is amnesia, the prevention of new memory formation.
Okay.
Third is analgesia, which is the blunting of the body's physical pain response. And fourth is immobility, ensuring there is no reflex movement when the surgeon actually makes an incision.
And the wild part is that there is no magical silver bullet drug that does all 4 perfectly. So anesthesiologists have to act like master mixologists.
They really do.
They use what's called balanced anesthesia. They administer hypnotics to knock out your consciousness, opioids to neutralize the pain, and paralytics or neuromuscular blocking agents to keep your muscles completely still.
And separating those functions is exactly where the sheer peril of the profession lies. Because you are using different chemical levers for different bodily systems, you introduce the possibility of medicine's absolute nightmare scenario.
You're talking about the misuse of paralytics.
Yes. Neuromuscular blocking agents do absolutely nothing to your brain.
Right.
They act entirely at the neuromuscular junction, which is the space where your nerves tell your muscles to contract, and they simply block the signal. So if an anesthesiologist administers a paralytic but fails to maintain enough of the hypnotic anesthetic,
The patient ends up fully paralyzed.
exactly, unable to flinch, unable to speak, or even blink, but completely conscious and aware of the surgery happening to them.
Hold on. Let me just parse this, because this touches on the difference between those first two pillars,
Oh.
unconsciousness and amnesia.
Right.
If we are using completely different drugs to target memory and awareness, does that mean those two systems can totally decouple? Like, could a patient theoretically be awake, experiencing the trauma of the surgery in real time, but simply be pharmacologically blocked from forming the memory of it?
It is chemically entirely possible. The
Yeah.
neural networks that process real-time awareness and the networks that encode long-term memories operate independently.
Wow.
You can drug the hippocampus to halt memory encoding while the cortex is still fully processing sensory input. This is exactly why a patient waking up and saying, "I don't remember anything," is not reliable scientific proof that they were actually unconscious during the procedure.
That is legitimately haunting.
It really is.
So if we are engineering these incredibly specific chemical states, decoupling memory from awareness, severing movement from sensation, how on earth are these molecules actually pulling this off at the cellular level?
This is where we dive into the physical chemistry and a genuinely baffling historical clue from the turn of the 20th century. Between 1899 and 1901, two scientists, named Hans Horst Meyer and Charles Ernest Overton, were testing a wildly diverse set of anesthetic gases.
And these molecules shared almost no structural similarities, right?
None at all. Yet they discovered a perfect correlation that seemed to make absolutely no logical sense. The sheer potency of an anesthetic gas could be perfectly predicted by one bizarre metric: how easily it dissolved in olive oil.
Wait, why olive oil? Is it because the oil acts as like a biological stand-in? Oh, wait, it mimics the fatty lipid layer of our cell membranes?
You nailed it. Neurons are encased in a lipid bilayer, essentially a layer of fat. Because all these structurally different drugs dissolved beautifully in fats, it led to the unitary theory of anesthesia. For decades, scientists believed anesthetics didn't target specific receptors like normal drugs. They thought these gases just melted into the fatty membrane of the neurons, physically swelled or distorted that fat, and indirectly crushed the tiny ion channels that neurons use to communicate. One physical mechanism to rule them all.
But the sources note that while this pure lipid theory was beautifully simple, it was ultimately wrong. Modern pharmacology had to issue a massive correction on that.
Yeah, it was an elegant but incomplete observation. Modern science revealed that these drugs absolutely do target specific proteins. They don't just melt into the fat, they seek out specific receptors on the neuron's surface to chemically tip the brain's delicate balance away from excitation and toward profound inhibition.
And there are two main molecular hubs that act as the primary targets here,
Mm-hmm.
the GABA-A receptors and the NMDA receptors. Let's dig into the how of this. How do drugs like propofol or the inhaled gas sevoflurane interact with GABA?
Okay, so GABA is the central nervous system's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It acts as the brain's chemical brake pedal.
Got it.
When a drug like propofol binds to the GABA-A receptor, it essentially jams that brake pedal all the way to the floor. It forces the receptor channel to stay open longer, which just floods the inside of the neuron with negatively charged chloride ions.
And because the neuron becomes so negatively charged, it effectively hyperpolarizes. Like, it becomes chemically impossible for it to fire off an electrical signal.
Exactly. The cortex and thalamus are suddenly washed in these hyper-inhibitory signals, basically plunging the brain into silence. But then you have the other route, the NMDA receptors, which are targeted by drugs like ketamine and nitrous oxide.
And they take the opposite approach, right? Instead of slamming on the brakes, they cut the accelerator line.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. NMDA receptors are normally activated by glutamate, which is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter, the gas pedal.
Right.
Ketamine physically blocks that receptor, so the glutamate just can't bind. By starving the brain of its excitatory signals, it creates a deeply dissociative state, which feels qualitatively very different from the heavy suppression of propofol.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. When neuroscientists finally put anesthetized patients into fMRI scanners, they realized the brain isn't just universally switching off.
No, it's not.
It's not like a master breaker switch. There is still localized electrical activity happening. What actually collapses is the crosstalk. The long-range communication between the frontal cortex, the parietal cortex, and the thalamus simply disintegrates.
And that specific frontoparietal network is widely believed to be the area that integrates all our scattered sensory inputs into one cohesive, unified, conscious experience.
So the analogy I was thinking of while reading this is like the brain isn't a house where someone goes to the basement and cuts the main power. It's more like a massive, bustling corporate office building.
Okay, I like this.
Everyone's still sitting at their desks, their computers are on, they're typing away, but someone has basically taken an axe to all the phone lines, the Ethernet cables, and the routers. The integration is completely gone.
I love that analogy. The individual departments might still be generating data, but the company has ceased to exist as a unified entity. This perfectly aligns with Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory of consciousness.
Oh, right.
Tony argues that consciousness literally is integration. Anesthesia proves his point. Chemically sever the integration, and the brain fragments into isolated islands. The mind just vanishes.
But if the brain isn't cleanly turned off, if it's just fragmented into these isolated islands, anesthesiologists must need incredibly precise ways to measure exactly how disconnected a patient is, right? To ensure those islands don't suddenly reestablish contact while a surgeon is working.
Absolutely, and this was the great clinical hurdle of the 20th century. How do you quantify the exact potency of a gas that shatters consciousness? In 1965, an anesthesiologist named Ted Eager solved it by creating the MAC standard, minimum alveolar concentration.
The textbook definition of MAC in these notes is a bit dense. It says it's the concentration of an inhaled gas at normal atmospheric pressure that prevents movement in response to a surgical incision in 50% of patients. Can we translate that into conversational English?
Definitely. So think of MAC as a baseline for potency. Imagine you have 100 patients in a room. The MAC is the exact percentage of anesthetic gas you need to pump into the air of that room to guarantee that exactly 50 of those patients will not flinch when a surgeon makes a cut.
Okay, that makes sense.
It gave doctors a hard comparable number to measure how strong these gases actually are.
And comparing those numbers yields some wild results. For instance, isoflurane has a MAC of just 1.2%. But nitrous oxide has an MA of over 100%.
Which highlights a vital physical limitation. A MAC over 100% means you would physically have to breathe in more nitrous oxide than the atmosphere can hold at normal room pressure just to go under. If you tried, you would completely deprive the patient of oxygen. This is exactly why nitrous is only ever used as a helper drug, never the main event for major surgery.
That clarifies a big misconception for me. I totally assumed breathing gas was an archaic thing of the past, replaced entirely by IV drips. But modern practice relies heavily on both.
It does.
The sources show they often use IV propofol to knock you out in seconds, the induction phase, because it hits the bloodstream instantly. But then they switch you to breathing a gas like sevoflurane to maintain the unconsciousness, because gas levels can be finely tuned breath by breath.
It is a beautifully elegant system today, but we really can't ignore that it was built on a foundation of harrowing historical errors. The margins of error with these drugs are razor thin, and the failures have shaped the modern operating room.
Like what?
Take the halothane hepatitis crisis in the 1950s. Halothane was supposed to be the ultimate upgrade from ether, non-flammable, fast-acting. But then patients started developing severe, sometimes fatal, liver necrosis.
The notes mentioned it was an immune reaction, not a direct poison.
Right, correct. As the liver tried to metabolize the halothane, the byproducts would bind to liver proteins, and the patient's own immune system would basically attack the organ.
Oh, man.
The risk spiked dramatically if a patient required multiple surgeries. It forced the pharmaceutical industry to invent the newer, safer gases we use today, which bypass liver metabolism almost entirely.
Then there is the tragic infamy of propofol outside the operating room. It revolutionized outpatient surgery because patients wake up with such a clear head without the heavy grogginess of older drugs. But its pharmacodynamics make it incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands.
Very dangerous. Propofol has an incredibly narrow therapeutic index, meaning the dose that puts you to sleep is dangerously close to the dose that stops your breathing entirely.
And Michael Jackson's death in 2009 was a tragic example of this, right? Due to the lack of proper monitoring.
Yes. Furthermore, unlike opioids, which have naloxone, or benzodiazepines, which have flumazenil, propofol has no reversal agent.
None at all.
None. If you give too much, you cannot chemically undo it. You have to mechanically breathe for the patient until it wears off. When it's administered in a home setting without an anesthesiologist managing the airway, it is lethal.
We also have to touch on a terrifying genetic vulnerability the sources highlight: malignant hyperthermia. It's rare, occurring in about 1 in 100,000 cases. But if a patient unknowingly carries a specific mutation in their RYR1 gene, exposure to standard anesthetic gas triggers their muscle cells to massively dump calcium.
It causes a hypermetabolic crisis. The patient's body goes completely rigid, their temperature skyrockets to fatal levels, and before the 1970s, it was almost universally a death sentence right there on the table.
Until they discovered the antidote, dantrolene, which stops the calcium release.
This raises an important point about the future of medicine, pharmacogenomics. It's the study of how your unique genetic code dictates your reaction to a drug. Finding dantrolene changed a guaranteed fatality into a manageable complication, provided the surgical team recognizes the genetic reaction in time.
But even with all these safeguards, the precise MC calculations, the emergency antidotes, we still face the lingering specter of accidental awareness. The notes reference a landmark 2004 study by Siebel that tracked 20,000 patients. They found that accidental awareness during surgery happens in roughly 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 cases.
It's a sobering statistic.
So, what does this all mean for the patient? If 1 to 1,000 people can experience accidental awareness, doesn't that highlight how incredibly difficult it is to measure a fundamentally subjective state using purely objective tools?
It is the defining struggle of the profession. How do you objectively measure the absence of a mind? To combat this, they developed tools like the bispectral index, a monitor that processes EEG brainwaves into a simplified numerical score representing the depth of anesthesia. But it isn't flawless.
Right.
We are also grappling with postoperative cognitive dysfunction, or POCD.
Right, the phenomenon where older patients wake up from surgery and suffer lingering cognitive decline, sometimes for months. But the sources show a massive debate around the actual cause. Is the anesthetic drug acting as a neurotoxin?
That is exactly the debate. Is it the chemical toxicity of the drug itself? Is it the massive cascade of systemic inflammation caused by the physical trauma of the surgery? Or, perhaps most concerningly, is the anesthesia simply unmasking an early-stage dementia that was already there, but hidden by the brain's daily routine? We are still mapping the exact toll this chemical fragmentation takes on the aging brain.
So to bring this all into focus, the next time you or a loved one requires surgery, remember the sheer complexity of what is happening. General anesthesia is not just a nice nap. It is a meticulously balanced chemical cocktail that actively fragments your brain's networks into isolated islands.
Yes.
It relies on 4 highly specific pharmacological pillars: unconsciousness, amnesia, analgesia, and immobility. The safety we enjoy today is built on the shoulders of dramatic, deeply human discoveries from the 19th century.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the impact of cracking these chemical codes is now spilling far beyond the surgical ward.
Oh, right, with mental health.
Exactly. We discussed how ketamine blocks the NMDA receptor. Researchers have recently discovered that administering sub-anesthetic doses of ketamine triggers rapid, profound antidepressant effects in treatment-resistant patients.
That's amazing.
The tools developed by anesthesiology are literally reshaping the frontier of modern psychiatry.
It's incredible how the mechanics of putting the brain to sleep might hold the key to waking it up from depression. Which really leaves us with a final, massive philosophical hook to chew on. Because anesthetics reliably toggle consciousness on and off, they have become one of the only empirical tools neuroscientists have to study what consciousness actually is.
They are the ultimate natural experiment for the mind.
If we can use these chemical tools to map the exact threshold of neural connectivity required to generate a conscious experience in an adult, what does that mean for how we measure consciousness in fetuses, or infants, or non-human animals?
It's a huge question.
It forces us to ask a profound, unsettling question. At what precise threshold of neural complexity does the capacity for suffering actually begin? Next time you think of anesthesia as simply flicking off a light switch, remember, you aren't turning off the power. You are severing the communication wires one by one and trusting the anesthesiologist to perfectly splice them all back together.